Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Pebble Inspector Podcast. Yeah, the Pebble Inspector, you know, the usual stuff. If you haven't listened to, if this is the first episode you're listening to, you probably want to go back and listen to some earlier episodes to understand what's going on, or don't, and just see if you can figure it out. I do a nice little intro normally about what the podcast is about, but I've said it so many times now that I can't be bothered. Well, I've said it 6 times. I am now, I am 2.5 weeks away from handing in my dissertation for my Masters in Creative Writing and Literature Studies at Lancaster Uni. The last few weeks I've broken down into spending a week on each of the 3 pieces that will make up my final collection to submit, and then a final week on my critical reflection, which is kind of what this is an audio version of, I suppose, that I'll be drawing upon when it comes to writing that. So last week we talked about the death of Princess Diana and inflatable skeletons and how that was coming along, which was great. And I think after recording last week's episode on the Thursday, it going out on the Friday, I had another really good day of writing on it, and then a couple of evenings over the weekend. And I think I gave myself a deadline till Sunday. I've discussed before how I work better to deadlines and briefs, a bit like when I was doing a real job. I gave myself till Sunday, and whatever shape it was in by then was the shape it was going to be. And I think I'm pleased with where it's got to, which is great. Yeah, real good. It's real good stuff. I think I said last week that I'd had a really concentrated couple of days writing on maybe the Monday or Tuesday earlier in the week, and felt really positive because I'd made such, albeit only 500 words, it felt like a huge change, and how it had added so much more. And then over the course of the week, after recording, I then went through it and was refining it, and I actually sort of cut about 500 words from that piece that I was talking about, and I kept in a lot of the new stuff. But what it allowed me to do was strip away a lot of the old stuff. And I think what I've been left with is a lot more denser in the story. You know, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more of a rich texture to the story. But I've trimmed away some of the fat. And I have to be careful there, because I think the fat, diversions and digressions, which I'll talk about in this week's piece, very relevant, are part of my writing. And it would be a shame to strip all that away to the point of it just being bland. So knowing what to cut and what not to. You know how like Wagyu beef is nice because it's marbled with fat. I mean, I'm vegetarian, so I haven't got a clue. But at the same time, you would maybe chop the excess fat off bacon. Maybe that's the difference. You want Wagyu, not gristle. I don't know. I'm not sure how far that metaphor extends. I'm not under a duvet today. I am in a cupboard. And there's no lighting, so I've got a head torch. So I'm sort of sat in which I think is running out of battery. So I'm sat in semi-darkness in a cupboard. I had to move a load of clothes out of the way to get in here. So I hope it's worth it in my never-ending pursuit of sonic or audio fidelity. Is that the term? Sonic purity? Who knows? Another good week of writing, I think. A very strange week, actually. Maybe because of the eclipse, I don't know, maybe that's had an effect. Maybe because of the eclipse and the meteor shower, maybe that's had some kind of effect on me. But I had some kind of writing-induced psychosis on, I think, perhaps Monday, which I sat down to start work on the piece that I spoke about a few weeks ago, which is the A to Z of reasons we are the way we are, which I'd had feedback from my supervisor, Owen, about the shape it was taking. And I had it in my head it was going to be this A to Z entry of almost like a portrait of a 1990s childhood and being slightly feral, and how that shaped my adulthood and also my relationships, particularly with my sister, and then how we then became these quite boring adults. It was quite a funny little piece, and we had lots of irreverence and seemingly irrelevant entries, and it was a really nice way of me kind of getting some words on a page as an exercise of write 3 entries per letter, coming up with the words and then coming up with the entries was really good. And the feedback from my supervisor was that it seemed to be that the nub of the story was building towards some sort of culminating event in our childhood that was a demonstration of our ferality that you could then counterpoint to our later domesticity. So he was kind of looking for perhaps to build a story in the entries somehow, which made sense to me, but seemed to me like structurally quite a tricky thing to do. I'm not saying possible, and perhaps for somebody more skilled than me it would be possible, or perhaps if I had more time I could do that. So I was a bit kind of worried about how I was going to think of these entries, and also because it was working as an A to Z. Obviously your punchline, your culmination, your event is going to come late in the alphabet. It's going to come around kind of maybe not Z, but maybe X, Y. And that means whatever entry you have for that, you have to make that word work, or that event work with that letter, which could have been a quite tricky thing. So I wasn't sure where to start, but I had an idea in my head of the event that it was going to be. And I'll explain the event before I do some readings, because I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's quite long. Or I'll explain how the writing came about, and this is maybe a little glimpse into the writing process, or not the writing process, because this is absolutely insane. This is the writing-induced psychosis that I suffered on Monday. I left the house intending to go... My office is... I go work in Wetherspoons, because it's free Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi is pretty reliable. You can order like a breakfast or a lunch with a hot drink, and then you get free refills. So rather than when I sit in a cafe and I feel like, I better buy another coffee, and I spend £3 a time on a really strong coffee that absolutely sends me over the edge, I can just hide in the corner in Wetherspoons, use the app, so nobody knows I'm there, nobody cares I'm there, because obviously there's all sorts in there. And I just go get free refills of coffee and tea. And I sit in there till probably from 10 till 5, and then at 5 o'clock I allow myself a pint. And then I keep writing, but I have that kind of... that's when I have my pint is when I go into reflective mode about what I've written. And it works really well, but it's a bit of a drive to the nearest Wetherspoons. So I went out the door fully intending to do that, and it was a really nice day. And I thought it seems a bit weird to drive and just go sit in a Wetherspoons. And so the door was locked and everything, but I just didn't go back inside. I just sat in the garden out the front, had my laptop and everything with me in readiness, and just sat there, and I didn't move for maybe 6 hours from that spot, and I just wrote, and I intended to write the culminating event that this A to Z was building towards, and then I'd figure out how to fit it in. That was my plan. But the more I wrote the event, the more I realised that you needed the context around it, and the more the context I wrote around it, the more diversions and segues and weird tangents I found myself going on, and I was really enjoying them. And it felt, this is kind of what people describe of that flow state that they enter into when writing, which I do find happens occasionally. And I didn't really know what was going to come out at the end of my fingers through the keyboard, but as I followed each memory and just tugged at each thread, then something else would come, and something else would come, and the shape of it, I just got them down on the page thinking, I'll trim whatever that I don't need. But what I ended up writing was 5,000 words in one sitting, which I don't think I've ever written 5,000 words in one sitting. I mean, 1,000 words a day is pretty good going, I think, good words. I wrote 5,000 words, and okay, not every single one of them was great, but the actual shape of the thing was very close to what I've kept. And yeah, I don't really know what happened, and I felt in a bit of a daze after that. I probably didn't even sit there for 6 hours. It was probably 4 hours, and then I spent another few hours just rereading and sort of fettling. And so Monday I gave myself this 5,000 word piece, which is obviously blows out the water the previous 3,000-4,000 word A to Z that I'd written. So I'm left with two pieces, and it's do I carry on with this weird all-in-one kind of stream of consciousness bit of writing, which is that feels like a risk because it's never been seen by anybody else. My supervisor hasn't seen it, although it came essentially from his suggestion, and includes a lot of the themes that he was talking about, but it completely abandons this A to Z. It is odd. It's an odd story. It's discursive, the word. It's very tangential. Or do I go back? I've spent several days on this now. So in a way I could have wasted several days if I then go back to my A to Z and try and make that work. And that's what I've been struggling with this week, aside from the actual writing, is what do I do with this thing? Do I keep following it and potentially waste time, or do I trust the process and go with it? So I think you probably guessed what I've done, but what I've decided. But that's where I'm at. Basically, he said, you need to come up with some kind of culminating event in your childhood or in your sister's childhood that this story can build towards. And I think he had it in his head that I would make something up. And then we were chatting about it. I said, it's just the usual stuff of growing up, siblings. Like, she kicked me into the head and she pulled a knife on me, and we used to fight, like physically fight quite seriously. And he was like, yeah, something like that would be great. And I said, actually, there was this one time that she got a taxidermied weasel and stuck olives in its eyes and then left it on the doorstep of one of her teachers and then got arrested by the police and taken in for questioning. And I told him this, and I could kind of see his face changing as I told him that story of like, this isn't normal. I thought, I know it is a very odd story, but everyone does mad stuff. But I think maybe this was slightly madder. So that's what I was starting from, but it felt like you needed a lot of context. So like, how did they get a taxidermied weasel? Who are they? What were their dealings with the police? Was this normal? All this sort of stuff. So that's kind of the road I've gone down. I'll do some readings from it. I think that's probably the best bet. And then I'll talk about what I've just started reading, which I think is going to be really useful. So I'll get to that after this. So I'll read a few bits. I'll read the opening. I should say, so this is based on real life, but it doesn't mean that every single thing that happens is true, if that makes sense. So names have been changed, and I've obviously elaborated on stuff, and there's certain things that I could never know that I've imagined, which is a theme through all my pieces. I have the giant turkey living on the farm. I have this Princess Diana skeleton balloon. So these are all fantastical things, and so I've taken that to a kind of not logical extreme, but I've extended that into my narration, where I'm narrating things that I can't possibly have witnessed, as if they were true. Which is what I'm aiming for, is this a kind of semi-fictional response to real events. Questions in my mind are that the other two pieces, the Diana piece and the Black Lane Ends piece, which I've written a lot more for actually recently as well. I think in the episode I talked about, I only had a few hundred words, and it's since expanded to over 2,000. Both pieces they have that neat clipped language, very compressed, quite spare, and fairly lyrical. And I could maintain that through the three pieces, and that was probably my intention. But for whatever reason, when I sat down on Monday to write this, to get it out and to get it flowing, I just allowed myself to write in as whatever free way I wanted to, so quite conversational, I suppose. When I reread it back, it feels like you've been cornered in a pub by an old boy at the end of the bar, and he's telling you this mad story, and he's going off on tangents, and you don't know where it's going. And it kind of doesn't go in. Well, it has a logical conclusion, but it's kind of a Shaggy Dog story, whereby the story goes on and mad tangents, and it's weird. But you end up with like a fairly kind of like innocuous punchline, and they're my favourite kind of jokes, where the joke is kind of on the audience because you're taking them for a ride. That's the joke. Maybe I've spoiled the joke by explaining it now, but anyway. So yeah, I let it flow however it came out. I didn't go for that kind of clipped, lyrical, compressed, uptight kind of language that maybe I use in some of the others. So we've got lots of really long sentences. It's very conversational. It's quite colloquial. I've tried to maintain, I suppose I'm embodying a teenage self in as much as I'm talking about my sister when she was a teenager and I was just coming into being a teenager. Not that I'm aping that voice. I'm not pretending to be 11 or whatever in this piece, but I'm trying to tell it in a way that brings that across. It has that flavour to it or whatever. So that's my idea. So I'll read you the opening few paragraphs. As I say, it is semi-fictional. I'm not saying all this happened. I'll let you decide which bits are real. So the piece is now called Rodent, for that reason, the weasel. My parents accompanied my sister to the interview room. A single officer sat opposite them, but the room was too small for that many people, and my dad had to sit at an awkward angle to the table, so that he was facing obliquely between my mum and sister on one side of the table, and the officer on the other, perched with his back almost to the door. The female officer, sitting opposite Sarah and mum with my dad sort of off to the side of them, explains all the usual stuff. I'm going to say Sarah is 16 at this point, but really it could be anywhere between 14 and 16. That's where she went a bit mad. Not mad, but compared to before, it was a bit mad. Grades plummeting, skiving off school. She'd always worn tracksuits and trainers and a scraped back ponytail with pencil straight hair either side of her face. But now it became a statement, a badge of belonging, 3 stripes and a tick and whatever logo Rockport's had. Once the officer had explained all that stuff, she gets everyone to agree that they understood. My dad's voice extra deep when he breaks his silence to agree. His voice dropped an octave. I don't really know if it was an octave, I don't know what one of those is, but it got lower anyway, whenever he was trying to be serious and angry with us. Sonorous, I suppose he was going for. A marker to indicate that forthwith, whatever he was about to say was not only serious, but was to be taken seriously. Hear thee, this is very much not a joke anymore, and you can tell it's not, because my voice has gone all low and quite slow. Take heed. Once they'd all agreed, and there'd been the right amount of pause whilst they all let that agreement sink in, and the officer had made a few notes on the pad in front of her, she looks up, first at my mum, then dad, and then settles on my sister. The officer still doesn't say anything, but breaks the moment with a blink and turns to her side in the chair. It makes a squeak as the plastic seat flexes over the rigid metal legs. It's a universal sound, that. Schools, doctors' waiting rooms, village halls, police interview rooms all have the same chairs. They stack nicely, have that hole in the back so you can carry them easily, and they're nearly always grey but can be black or blue. These ones are blue. The ones at my school were grey. I was, and still am, 5 years younger than Sarah, and at the time still in primary school. My friend Wayne, he had 9 brothers and sisters, and they all shared 3 bedrooms stuffed full of bunk beds in a house near the school and didn't have a landline, so they had to use a phone box at the end of the street. And I were given the job of putting out and putting away the chairs and tables for dinner time in the hall. The school isn't there anymore. It was a serious-looking old building with high windows crisscrossed with white sashes, which made interesting shadows you could watch all day, and classrooms in a row off to one side of the hall. The floor was that parquet stuff with such a thick layer of resin on top that you could dig your thumbnail into it while sat cross-legged in an assembly. That floor must have been cross-hatched with 100 years of half-moon dints by the time it was all ripped out. A shame to lose it, really. Okay, so those are the first, page and a half. So obviously I've transitioned from this interview room scene to my own childhood recollections, and that's the whole point, is the interview scene is what takes up the whole story, as in that's the span of it, but I use it as a jumping off point. Conversational style, it's colloquial, there's some sort of like odd grammar in there, but I've been trying to work hard between making it understandable on the page, because obviously we speak very differently to how we write, but maintaining that voice without it feeling kind of like I'm doing a bit, I suppose. I really hate that. Sometimes writers, and they get a lot of acclaim for doing it, they write in an almost childlike or kind of thicko way. That's it, I'll get cancelled for saying that. They write in like a childlike or overly simple way with this idea that they're exposing, they're trying to say, look, the story or the feeling is more important than highfalutin language. And I guess that is what I'm going for. You know, I've avoided like really big long words or some of the weird kind of metaphors that I normally go for. Or if I do go for a metaphor, it's the kind of one that you maybe would come up with in the moment as opposed to a, really literary one. So yeah, I suppose I am going for that, but mine's better. No, I don't know. It's just trying to get that balance, I guess, isn't it? Yeah, so I diverge off. I suppose I'll skip ahead a little bit. There's lots of fourth wall breaking and stuff, so I'll start with that. My dad would have been facing the side of the box, which might have felt a bit strange. I wonder if any of them had the urge to rearrange him a bit, like adjusting cutlery at a set table, like he needed squaring up. The box is just a standard cardboard box, but not a packaging box. One of those boxes for filing stuff, perfectly square with a close-fitting lid. This one doesn't have a lid on, but it probably has one that matched. She must have left it off in another room. On the side, in marker, is written, rodent. This story ends not too long after this, but I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, past the end to a couple of moments of my own dealings with the police. Nothing too extreme, but they might be worth mentioning. Not even run-ins, just sort of walk-pasts, really. The first was when I was about 17 and walking home from something like a night out with 2 friends. We weren't really drunk, just 17, and it was late, and we had had enough drinks to make the walk home seem not bad. One friend bet me I couldn't climb a high stone wall beside the road, and I bet that I could, and I did. Once on top of the wall, the other 2 found their own ways up, and then we lowered ourselves back to the road. As I let go of the wall and plopped to the few feet to the pavement, a police car happened to be passing, and the prospect of catching 3 hoodlums in the act was too good to pass up, so the car pulled alongside. I don't remember much of the policeman, except he was young. Older than us, but young. Maybe only 5 years older than us. And he had lightish hair under the hat he pulled on when he got out. He asked us, but mostly me, since I was the one he'd actually seen climbing down, where we'd jumped from, and I said the top of the wall. He said he knew that, but what was behind the wall? I mustn't have understood why he was asking this, because I said, I'm not sure, sorry, gardens, I think. So then he asked, you don't know what's behind the wall? No, not really. Which seemed to annoy him, and he asked, so what are you doing? He, I pointed at my friend here, asked me if I could climb that wall, so I did. And he, the police officer, said, would you do anything that him meaning my friend, asked? This is a bit like being asked if you thought something was funny when you got caught doing it at school. You have to say no, but really the answer is yes, because that's exactly why you do it. You wouldn't do it if you didn't think it was funny. At this moment, and this will sound made up, but it did actually happen, a hedgehog was snuffling along the road beside us. The young officer pointed to it and asked if I'd eat that hedgehog if he asked me to. I wasn't sure if he meant he, as in himself, the officer, asked me to eat the hedgehog, or if he meant if he, as in my friend, asked me to eat the hedgehog. But either way, it was really hard to respond to a question like that. Obviously the answer is no, I wouldn't eat that hedgehog. But it seemed so obvious that I struggled to say it, and instead I said something like, well, that's a very different question, and anyway, I'm vegetarian, so no, I wouldn't. He must have got a bit bored, and the hedgehog had already moved on by then, so he, the officer, not the hedgehog, said that I didn't exactly look like Raffles the gentleman burglar, which was a weird thing to say, and that we could go, just don't go climbing any more walls that aren't ours. Then he took off his hat, one of those flat, round ones with a peak, not the ones that look like a bell end, and got back into his car and drove away. So that was odd. So that's quite a long section. It's a big paragraph in the middle with lots of long sentences and really weird back and forth. I've opted for, because I'm so edgy, no quotation marks or speech indicators, because it's reported speech as opposed to quoted speech, I think is the reason. No, that is the reason. But I wanted to get across the idea of this, these, again, I maintain that we all have these experiences, particularly when we're young, of stuff that just happens and is actually pretty weird when you come back to look at it. And basically this story is just full of those kind of anecdotes. But it's the weird everydayness of them. This hedgehog snow, that did really happen. I can't remember whether he said eat it, but he, whether kick it or, whatever he said. And I just remember being in that situation. That's a really, really fucking weird thing for a policeman to say. And the Raffles gentleman burglar is real as well. He did say that. This is 20 years ago, I should point out as well. So it's all remembered through that lens. But I wanted to highlight the weirdness of the everyday, I guess. And the rodent element, it was handy that was in there. And then, should I read you I've got quite a long... Yeah, I'll read you another police encounter. Again, as I say, not everything that I've written is true. I've changed all the names. The other time was when I was at university. I was in bed and someone was knocking on the front door, downstairs, and it must have been fairly early because no one else was answering, and I was the one who always woke up first anyway. We'd been drinking snakebite all night, and my head felt as if someone had stuck a bike pump into my skull via an ear or a nostril and gone to town. It was like there wasn't enough room in there, and my brain had swollen and was trying to get out from around my eyes. I always thought it was weird when older people, used to say, oh, it's okay for you when you're young, you can get away with drinking so much and be up playing football the next morning. This has never been true for me. Even when I was really young, when I first started drinking properly, taking it seriously, I would get vicious hangovers, proper kicked in the head in a back alley headaches, and an all-at-sea nausea, and I don't like football. I pulled on some baggy, linen-y kind of cotton trousers, a bit like pyjama bottoms really, but I don't wear pyjamas, so they were just what I wore when I couldn't be bothered with real clothes, which was quite often. So these really light, kind of pyjama-looking, kind of hippie-ish trousers that weren't really pyjamas did nothing to hide my morning erection, and I got down the stairs. I had to hold the banister really tightly and run my other hand along the bumpy wallpaper, anaglypta, which is an odd word. I ran my hand down that, and I could feel every bump, each one a swelling wave on an ocean, and I got to the bottom of the stairs and the hallway. I could see through the wobbly glass in the front door that there were two people, and at least one of them was knocking at the door. So me and my little half erection answered the door to two police people. They asked if I lived here, which I did, and they asked if I owned the car out the front, which I didn't, and whether I knew the person who did, which I did, and whether that person lived here, which technically they didn't, but he was going out with my housemate, and they spent all the time in the converted loft and smoked weed out the Velux all day. Ben was shorter than me and from Hull. They once invited me up there for a smoke. The room was small and mysteriously lit with a warm orange pink. I think Bridget must have hung fabric from the walls and low-angled ceiling and positioned lamps on the floor. It looked like a Bedouin tent, but kind of sexy, but also fake. A museum display of a sexy Bedouin tent. And we smoked, and I got stuck to the little squishy cube thing I was sat on. This always happens when I smoke weed. I get stuck to furniture. I melted into a sofa once, just a puddle with a head. Another time I got welded to a stool, one of those little wooden milking ones, so my knees were up near my chest. That time I was obsessing over some moths that seemed to be attracted to an orange crocheted throw on a sofa, a different one to that first one, that two people were actively fucking on. I might get rid of the a different one to that first one. It disrupts the delivery of that line. So it would be, that time I was obsessing over some moths that seemed to be attracted to an orange crocheted throw on a sofa that two people were actively fucking on. And then in my first year at university, there was this guy who never spoke to any of us, except for the one time he did speak to me, and he invited me outside for a smoke. And it must have been skunk or something really strong, because I forgot the door code and how doors work. And he asked if I wanted to play Call of Duty, but he just called it COD. And I had to shake my head because I couldn't talk and go lie down on my bed. And a cornflower grew from the cornflower and water, which is called a non-Newtonian fluid, that was somehow in my mouth. And I was surrounded by mourners who were my other flatmates. And I was at my wake with this little blue flower growing from my mouth. This wasn't as bad as that, but I got stuck to the little squishy cube thing in Bridget's fake sexy Bedouin tent, and Ben pulled a whitey, but couldn't handle the steep stairs from the loft, so had to vomit out the skylight, but he was too short to get his head out, so he had to do a pull-up on the edge of the window every time he retched, which was quite a lot, and hold himself there whilst he threw up onto the roof. She said seagulls came and ate it all the next day. I didn't mention all this to the police, though. I kept all that stuff about sexy Bedouins and seagulls eating vomit to myself. They wouldn't understand. So it was his car, but he didn't live here, and was he in? I thought so, but couldn't be sure, and could I go get him? So I went to try and get him, and my erection had almost completely subsided by now. They wouldn't get up, so I went back downstairs, entirely flaccid, and told them that, and they told me to ask him to remove the magazine that was left on the dashboard of his Vauxhall Astra, because it is illegal to display pornographic material in public, and that they'd be back later to check. They went after that. I waited a few minutes, then went out to have a look, and they were right. There was a double-page spread, with different angles and poses in little cutouts to the side, open on the dashboard. I looked at it for a bit longer, and then went back inside, and I think those are my two main dealings with the police. I then go on to explain one more dealing with the police when I crashed my car. It then moves on to mine and my sister's relationship when we were kids. So I'll read this one, and then I'll read the finish. Sarah and I didn't get on when we were kids. 5 years is a big gap. A 10-year-old is like a wasp at a picnic to a 15-year-old. We fought a lot, proper, and I think this is the perfect word for it, scrapping. Wild and flailing fights where every opportunity is taken. Pulled hair and kicked groins and scratches and swinging you round by the arm till you spin off like a meteor into furniture or a door. Proper headbanging and headlocks and headbutts. She pulled a knife on me once, a big kitchen knife out of the drawer, waved it in front of me, sort of stabbing the air between us with every consonant of whatever she was saying. That was one of her tricks, using consonants. No, it's not consonants, is it? It's syllable. Syllable. Bloody hell. Hey, you guys are in the swirling eye of the editing shitstorm. Be syllable. Much better. There we go. Sort of stabbing the air between us with every syllable of whatever she was saying. That was one of her tricks, using syllables to time her jabs. Pinning me on a sofa and spelling it out with punches to my head and ribs. Don't punch. Ever punch. Do punch. That punch. Ah, punch. Again, punch. It's a good job her vocabulary wasn't better. I got away with mostly single-syllable beatings, low-scoring Scrabble beatings. I don't reckon she would have used the knife on me, but it was pretty effective still. She had a big scar on her arm from a rusty nail sticking out of the piece of wood she was climbing over in a skip. She tried to jump over the side, and this big rusty nail drew along her arm. I remember this purple and shiny and smooth twitching thing inside the cut. It was her bicep, and the slice bled like mad, and we ran back to the house with my t-shirt wrapped around it. I have a much smaller scar on my arm from punching the glass of our front door through. I'd meant to punch the wood, but went too high and the glass cut me. The blood was all over my arm, so I thought I'd cut my wrist and I was going to die very soon. I ran the tap over it, but it wouldn't stop bleeding, and all that happened was my blood and the water was washing away down the drain. But at least I could see my wrist wasn't cut, and I might not die that soon. Sarah told me they were going to send me to anger management classes after this. They weren't, they didn't. But obviously I believed her, so then I started crying, and then I went to hospital. We must have had to call mum or dad at work, and they must have had to come home to take me because it was the summer holidays, and Sarah was meant to be looking after me. They fished around in my arm for glass, and they sewed it up with thick black stitches, stiff where they poked out of the skin. So neither of those scars on her arms were each other's fault, just our own, but she did knock me out once. And then I explained how she knocked me out. We then have a nice little resolution where I basically go on to say that we don't do any of that anymore, and we just go drink coffee and our kids play on the park and we're nice and normal. And she went on to study law and stuff. Sarah had a friend, Leanne. She lived up the road with her mum, stepdad and sister. A man, possibly her uncle, occasionally lived in a mostly converted ice cream van parked outside, the inside pasted with cutouts and posters from motorbike magazines, each bike draped with a naked or almost naked woman. He might have been the stepdad's son, actually. I can't remember, but he didn't, as far as I know, own a motorbike. Leanne's stepdad was much older than her mum, well into his 70s. He walked with a limp and used a stick, but he still had long white hair and wore a leather waistcoat like a roadie. He dealt in antiques and kept a large pet snake in the shed. He would let us feed it, decapitating frozen chicks with a paint scraper and then dropping them into the tank, waiting for an age to see it eat them, but it never did, not whilst we watched anyway. His antiques were all from the house clearances and job lots. His use of the word antiques covered a broad range of stuff, leftovers of lives that nobody missed. One of his specialities was taxidermy. He would buy up the specimens that no one else touched. Lucky dip boxes of cross-eyed foxes and balding rabbits, fish missing their tails and their bamboo skeletons poking out from their insides, dark and musty. Their house was a graveyard of these things, rancid, scabies-ridden examples of where craft met hate crime. I was also briefly in love with her younger sister, Jessica. Should it be poking out from their dark and musty insides? Yeah, it should be. Oh, lads, you are absolutely their dark and musty insides. Wow, dark and musty insides, that's good. The box marked rodent sits on the table for a moment or two longer. People will study timing like this for a lifetime. The correct number of beats between setup and payoff, and perhaps the police officer is one of those people, or perhaps she has just stumbled across it by chance. But however it came about, it was too much for Sarah. The officer stands up from her seat to reach into the box, her arms almost disappearing as she reaches to get her hands underneath and then lifts the evidence from the box and places it on the table. I think we've got reach and box too many times in that sentence, so we'll adjust that. This fucking thing. How any of them except my sister held it together is unfathomable. I'm just going to highlight that so I remember to do it. I thought I was finished. The officer's hand dip into the box and pull out a paper plate and lays it beside the first thing, and on it, written in ketchup, yum yum. The more Sarah tries to resist, the more explosive it comes out, like a burst pipe. The laughter runs away from her, across the table and into the box and around the officer and right up my parents' noses, mustardy and stinging. Why did they have to label it rodent? Wasn't it normally Exhibit A or whatever? The seriousness of the situation, the pauses for dramatic effect from the officer, and the way my dad's spine refused to touch the back of the chair, the way his hands were held together like a prayer, the two hands hanging between his legs, and the way my mum was so small and tiny and hadn't blinked the entire time and just stared from my sister to the officer and hadn't said a word in the car or as they walked up to the station door. It all built to this. There is a joke about how to tell the difference between stoats, weasels and otters. One is utterly different. But I can never remember which way round stoats and weasels go. This is either a stoat or a weasel, definitely not an otter. The weasel, we'll stick with this for now, is captured in what was probably meant to be an aggressive or powerful action-filled pose, with one forepaw off the plinth on which the rest stood, amongst a tableau of rock and moss. Its fur is patchy and the body shape off, bulging and twisted in anatomically impossible ways. The tail turned back around the body with tufted black bristles. Its head is held high, flung back, and its mouth wide open as if in a roar. Not that I think weasels or stoats do actually roar, and between its tiny teeth, the ones not already knocked loose and missing, it holds a single stuffed green olive. The black ball-bearing eyes have been skewered with toothpicks, on the end of which are two more stuffed olives. Sarah has to leave the room. My mum goes with her, which is really awkward with my dad in the way of the door, so he has to sort of shuffle his chair towards the police side of the desk, little hops along the lino, squeak, squeak, squeak. I don't know what was said, but when they came back in, Sarah first, followed by my mum, she stopped laughing, as in Sarah has, though her face is still red, her eyes still full of tears that streak down her cheeks, and her top lip is pulled down over her teeth as if she's sucked on a lemon. She can't look at the weasel. But yeah, they left it on the teacher's doorstep, which I talk about. After that, I suppose the weasel was thrown away, but I don't know if the police would have done that, or if it was given back to them, my parents and sister, and they had to walk out of the station, holding this thing out in front of them like a birthday cake when all the candles are lit, ready to start singing. Or maybe the police kept it as evidence, like those rows and rows of shelves of boxes you see on TV, or at the end of Indiana Jones. That weasel just stays on a police shelf for years, gathering dust and the olives shrivelling up, and the ketchup drying, and the years later they clear it out, and the look on the face of the new recruit they get to do it when they find this fucking monstrosity, and they're wondering why is it even there. Fucking olives for eyes, though. Fucking olives. And then basically, I'm not going to read it now, but I go on to explain that I then went to school the next year as she left. And I started the year she left, and basically the teachers recognised my name in the register, and I had this kind of reputation preceding me of what my sister was like, sharing this surname with her, if not the kind of behavioural traits. I've obviously gone for like a more comic register, a much more conversational, colloquial style. I'm hoping that works. My concern, I guess, is that the rest of the collection, the other two pieces, are very similar. As I said before, kind of got this compressed lyrical style, whereas this very much isn't. Got long sentences, it's rambling, it's discursive and tangential. So I don't know how that'll be received by the markers, but then I also have treated the whole Masters as an opportunity to experiment, and I think I want to show experimentation in my work rather than just turning up with a finished, if not finished piece, then a finished style. I think I want to show that I'm trying lots of different things, and maybe that might affect my mark, but maybe that's more valuable than the mark, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, I've sort of done that with other pieces and I've got decent marks, so maybe it's okay, but it's the fact that I'm presenting it as a collection. I've not written anything before with a comic register for the degree, so it's not something they're perhaps expecting from me. But then also at the same time, that's okay, I think. So I think what I have decided is that I'm going to have confidence in my writing, which is something that I did the degree to get. Basically, I was writing and I was like, no way of knowing if this is good. And then I did the idea was I would do the degree and somebody who knows what they're talking about and go yes or no, which is a really roundabout and silly way of doing it, because you should be writing for writing's sake, not for validation. And I do enjoy writing for writing's sake, and I think I would carry on doing so in whatever way that I found to do it. But I think I wanted to see if it was worth pursuing elsewhere, as a career, or as at least as a something. And for that, I did need that kind of external validation, because ultimately that's what a reader is, I guess, to the writer, is an external thing. Anyway, I don't know if that's true. Yeah, very different piece. I hope that means it's going to be okay. I don't know. I'm going to keep pecking away at it. Like you heard then, there's still parts that I'm not quite sure on, especially because I've got such long sentences. But I'm trying to create that conversational, almost kind of runaway style, which necessitates those long sentences, and I'm breaking away from my usual instinct for short sentences. But in doing so, you tie yourself up in these grammatical knots, these kind of like weird roundabout ways of saying things. But that is the point. And you're talking about this rambling guy in a pub who's cornered you. They do the same thing. They kind of have to I mean this guy, not this guy. I mean, the one I was talking about before, not that one, this one. And I'm trying to recreate that a little bit without it becoming too much of a gimmick, I guess. So we'll see if that's successful or not. I hope you enjoyed that, I guess. Well, if you didn't, what are you going to do? Yeah, so that's that. I've got, I'm going to keep working it until Sunday. I'm doing this today, I'm recording the cast today. I usually dedicate Thursdays to recording and editing this episode, which is really useful because it comes halfway through the week-ish, and it allows me time to make the changes that I stumble across in the reading of it and the talking about it, which is what happened last week and the week before. It definitely unlocks something in that process for me. So Thursdays are kind of given over to this, Thursday evenings back to writing. Friday is pretty much a writing day. And then the weekends tend to be just evenings. But I find that by that point, I'm into just editing mode, kind of close line edits, not huge changes. I've made some pretty big changes to this one, actually, as it's been going, even though it only started life on Monday. The main change being I switched the tense of the interview scene. So it opens in the past tense, and then I switch. It's almost like I introduce it, and then for the next scene, the next paragraph, we then, if we're talking in kind of like cinematic styles, we then enter the scene as a point of view, a present point of view, as opposed to a kind of slightly distant, over-the-shoulder retrospective, which I think works really well. It creates a different register to the definitely retrospective memory stuff that I then go into about school and university and police and my relationship with my sister. So I think that works quite well. I think when I had it before, it was all past tense, and so it was quite hard to understand when this had happened, when the other stuff I was talking about had happened, and it gives it like a nice switch. So one of the things I think they look for in the marking scheme is ambitious use of form, and I wouldn't say this is hugely ambitious in that respect. I think some of my others perhaps are, but at least I'm showing some divergence and some difference and some thought that goes into that, is my idea. I'm not just writing it for the marking scheme, but it is in the back of my mind. Yeah, so I'd say that was one of the main changes. I had more detail in the recollections of stuff, more biographical detail, I guess, about some of the people I was talking about, but also about myself. And I then had to go through that, and it's okay, some tangential stuff, some diversions are good, but how many are a diversion from a diversion from a diversion, and do they really progress the story as much as there is one? Or is it just, it's nice for me to remember that? And so I had to cut a lot of that stuff as well. And it's not that it was not good, it was just, it wasn't necessary. And this is a long piece. This is 5,300 words of a 12,000 word maximum total dissertation, whatever. So this is going to be the biggest piece, and I think, and so I need to rein it in a little bit. But I think I'm pleased with, I enjoyed writing it, and I think ultimately that's the most important thing. Whenever I've come to handing in work in, for the previous modules, this is slightly different because it's obviously like the big one. But when I've been handing in work for modules and I'm really uncertain about it because I just don't know, because I've just not done this before and I don't know what they're looking for, and I've not been in education for so long, and I just don't know whether I'm the right fit and all this sort of stuff. But what I've stopped myself with that kind of cycle of thought, and I've I've said to myself, but did I enjoy it? And have I enjoyed writing it? And the answer is always yes. And do I enjoy reading what I've written? Yes. And I don't want to receive a fail, obviously, and I haven't done yet, fortunately. And maybe a fail would be a step too far. A really low mark would perhaps shatter me. But if I get a lower mark than perhaps I want, I need to remember that I'm learning, and that's the point. And I enjoyed it. And the mark is a secondary thing to that journey, not the end point, I guess, which sounds like somebody making an excuse for low marks. I've not actually received any particularly low marks. My short story module had a lower mark than all my other modules, which I was disappointed about because short stories are so important to me. But I, with time, and even at the time of receiving that grade and reading the feedback, which was all very fair, I could see it as just, this is where to improve and make yourself better. It's not saying you're a shit writer and you'll never be a good writer. It's just saying, yep, this is exactly on the right path. Here's some stuff you can change. And the mark was like a distinction still. Like, it's not like I flunked it, but it's just compared to the other marks, it was kind of lower. And it's also like a mindset thing of, I've got to do as well as possible. I guess because I'm paying for this really fucking expensive course and I've given up my job to do it, I better do well at it. So yeah, really enjoyable process to write in a very different register. I really enjoyed it. I think it just needs a few little tweaks over the next few days. And then what I'll probably do is I've printed it out and made some corrections on paper, which really helped. But I think what my next thing to do is to, as well as this podcast, which is really helpful for me going through it, but also to just read it all out loud from end to end and then listen back to it while walking the dog or something. And then I can listen for those stumbles in the sentences and stuff. And I pick up quite a lot as I read it out loud, as you've seen or heard, I should say. Because I'm in this now, this final sprint for the finish, I haven't felt like there's much time for reading, or there is time, but I was so knackered on Monday after writing this. It's really strange. I felt physically exhausted after doing it. And I think it was just because my brain was switched on for so long that, and it was the same last week when I had a couple of really good days on the other piece. It does really take it out of you. And I find by the time I get to the end of that, not the last thing I want to do, but I just find I don't have the energy to pick up a book, or a book that I feel like I should really paying attention to. I think I could pick up, a bit more of like a fun, I don't want to say throwaway book, but you know what I mean? Something that's easy that I've read before, or that I know that I'm going to like, or whatever. So I basically have, throughout my life and my reading life, I have these certain books that I'll return to, or like series that I'll return to, where I'll read like quite a tricky non-fiction book, like a history, or I'll read like a proper novel, kind of Booker Prize winning, or, classic novel. I'll read Master and Margarita, and then I'm like, right, my brain needs a rest, and I read either Terry Pratchett, Bill Bryson, Flashman novels by George MacDonald Fraser, or the Sharp novels by Bernard Cornwell. But yeah, any of those books is like a balm to my brain, and I find them so easy to read, and I just really enjoy them. They're really safe for me. Yeah, there you go. So I've not been reading as much as a result of that. I've read a little bit more of Possession, but not as much as I was hoping, because it falls into that category of like slightly challenging book. And I just find that my brain is already full of what I'm doing with my pieces. In fact, to the point where I had a dream the other night and I was editing the dream. So the dream was happening, whatever was happening in the dream, whatever. I don't want to talk about that. Not because that makes it sound like it was weird. It wasn't a weird dream. Well, it was weird that I was editing it, but it wasn't a weird dream. It wasn't like I don't think it was. I don't remember it. Anyway, I just don't like it when people explain their dreams. I had a dream, and in the dream I was editing it. I was saying, well, maybe we could put that first, and if we took this out and then this happened. So I'm like, I can't even rest when I'm sleeping. It's insane. Anyway, so this is why I'm thinking it's like writing-induced psychosis. But what I have talked about before is the shorter form books of essays or short stories or ideas, where you can dip in and take a little bit from them, and they're interesting and they're thought-provoking, but the length of you only have to read one essay, a couple of pages, a short story, and you've got something out of it without expecting too much. You feel like you've achieved something because you've read that essay or you've read that story, but you haven't demanded hours and hours of attention from yourself when you're actually quite tired, or you're actually quite fatigued. In last week's episode, I spoke about Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking. That's arrived. I'm not read it yet, but it's there, ready to read. And then I also was reading about Annie Dillard. So Annie Dillard, she wrote Teaching a Stone to Talk, which I think is perhaps one of her more well-known collections. But I ordered that, and I ordered a collection of her essays called The Abundance. She won the Pulitzer Prize, apparently, according to the front of this book. To be honest, I do judge books by their cover. When I'm buying stuff that I think is going to be useful, I don't bother with that. I buy, if somebody says you should read this book because it'll be useful for your degree, I'm just going to buy the book. I don't care about the cover. And this was one of those books because I was reading about her and it seemed like the style of writing that would be instructive for me. But the cover is absolutely lovely. Nice little misty woods, very much what I would go for. Excellent. And she writes essays, but she takes them to quite strange places. A lot of expansive, good kind of nature writing, I suppose, but in a quite cosmic way. It feels very freewheeling and confident and physical and embodied. She exists within this world, but the world is not just the physical, it's the metaphysical. It's her responses to it, or the emotion of it, or the quite trippy, basically, is what I'm trying to say, some of the stuff. And I don't think I'd ever read any of her before. I don't think. First of all, the introduction to it is really good. It's by Jeff Dyer. And the first essay, interestingly, is about witnessing an eclipse. So I read it the night before the eclipse, so it felt very appropriate. So I'm actually going to read a couple of passages from that. And I think her language, she's far and above anything I'm doing, but her language, her use of language, her use of the natural world as part of that is as much part of her experience as her internal self is really instructive. And her boldness of taking life experience and memoir and life writing and real stuff and allowing the excesses of the imagination to get in between the cracks is really good. So this is called, it's from Teaching a Stone to Talk. So I've bought that, and I've bought this collection of essays which has a lot of them out of Teaching a Stone to Talk. But anyway, we'll deal with that. So this is called Total Eclipse. It had been like dying, that sliding down the mountain pass. It had been like the death of someone, irrational, that sliding down the mountain pass and into the region of dread. It was like slipping into fever or falling down that hole in sleep from which you wake yourself whimpering. We had crossed the mountains that day, and now we were in a strange place, a hotel in central Washington, in a town near Yakima. The eclipse we travelled here to see would occur early the next morning. I lay in bed. My husband, Gary, was reading beside me. I lay in bed and looked at the print on the hotel room wall. It was a print of a detailed and lifelike painting, clearly contemporary, of a smiling clown's head made all out of vegetables, the old Arcimboldo idea, but junk. It was an image of the sort which you do not intend to look at, and which, alas, you never forget. Some tasteless fate presses it upon you. It becomes part of the complex interior junk you carry with you wherever you go. 2 years have passed since the total eclipse of which I write. During those years, I have forgotten, I assume, a great many things I wanted to remember, but I have not forgotten that clown print or its lunatic setting in the old hotel. So, it's just great stuff, isn't it? In what, I don't know how many words that is, but in a page, less than a page, she's taken us from a dreamlike sequence of falling down a mountain into a very real valley, a very real place. She's told us she's looking for an eclipse. She's told us that she's lying next to her husband, who's called Gary, and that she's looking at this painting, and she's told us all about this painting. So that, brilliant. And then skip ahead a little bit. So this is the eclipse itself. It began with no ado. Odd that such a well-advertised public event should have no starting gun, no overture, no introductory speaker. I should have known right then that I was out of my depth. Without pause or preamble, silent as orbits, a piece of the sun went away. We looked at it through welder's goggles. A piece of the sun was missing. In its place we saw empty sky. I had seen a partial eclipse in 1970. A partial eclipse is very interesting. It bears almost no relation to a total eclipse. Seeing a partial eclipse bears the same relation to seeing a total eclipse as kissing a man does to marrying him, or as flying in an aeroplane does to falling out of an aeroplane. Although the one experience precedes the other, it in no way prepares you for it. During a partial eclipse, the sky does not darken, not even when 94% of the sun is hidden. Nor does the sun, seen colourless through protective devices, seem terribly strange. We've all seen a sliver of light in the sky, since we've all seen the crescent moon by day. During a partial eclipse, the air does get cold, precisely as if someone was standing between you and the fire, and blackbirds do fly back to their roosts. It is strange enough. I had seen a partial eclipse before, and here it seemed was another. What you see in a total eclipse is entirely different from what you know. It is especially different from those of us whose grasp of astronomy is so frail that, given a flashlight, a grapefruit, 2 oranges and 15 years, we could not figure out which way to set the clocks for daylight saving time. Usually it is a bit of a trick to keep your knowledge from blinding you, but during an eclipse it is easy. What you see is much more convincing than any wild-eyed theory you may know. Yeah, just the way she builds repetition and experience, and then some really nice imagery, flying an airplane, falling out of an airplane, kissing a man, marrying him. It's just, so good. When you first read something from somebody for the first time, you haven't read it before and you don't know what to expect particularly, and you may be hoping that it's going to be really good, and you're like, what if it's shit? And then within a few sentences you just feel like, okay, yeah, this I'm okay. This person knows. Yeah, just really fantastic bit of writing. Let's try one last little bit because it's just really good. The Crab Nebula in the constellation Taurus looks, through binoculars, like a smoke ring. It is a star in the process of exploding. Light from its explosion first reached the Earth in 1054. It was a supernova then, and so bright it shone in the daytime. Now it is not so bright, but is still exploding. It expands at the rate of 70 million miles a day, yet it does not budge. Its apparent size does not increase. Photographs of the Crab Nebula taken 15 years ago seem identical to photographs of it taken yesterday. Some lichens are similar. Botanists have measured some ordinary lichens twice, at 50-year intervals, without detecting any growth at all, and yet their cells divide, they live. The small ring of light was like these things, like a ridiculous lichen up in the sky, like a perfectly still explosion 4,200 light years away. It was interesting and lovely and in witless motion, and it had nothing to do with anything. It had nothing to do with anything. The sun was too small and too cold and too far away to keep the world alive. The white ring was not enough. It was feeble and worthless. It was as useless as a memory. It was as off-kilter and hollow and wretched as a memory. When you try your hardest to recall someone's face or the look of a place, you see in your mind's eye some vague and terrible sight such as this. It is dark, it is insubstantial, it is all wrong. The white ring and the saturated darkness made the earth and sky look as they must look in the memories of the careless dead. What I saw, what I seemed to be standing in, was all the wrecked light that the memories of the dead could shed upon the living world. We had all died in our boots on the hilltops of Yakima, and we were alone in eternity. Empty space stopped our eyes and mouths. We cared for nothing. We remembered our living days wrong. With great effort we recalled some sort of circular light in the sky, but only the outline. And then the orchard trees withered, the ground froze, the glaciers slid down the valleys and overcame the towns. If there had ever been people on earth, nobody knew it. The dead had forgotten those they loved, parted one from the other. They could no longer remember the faces and lands they had loved in the light. They just stood on the darkened hilltops, looking down. I mean, fucking hell. Annie, seriously, fuck you. Christ. Honestly, what right has she to write so well, huh? Leave some for the rest of us. Just so fucking good. But the way she takes that real thing and she just moves you around the fucking chessboard, and she's doing a dance. She's on this chessboard. She's moving pieces that didn't even know they could move that way. And before you know it, you're in check, and she's landed you right where you began. Actually, I was about to say she's on the other side of the board. She's not. She's right where you began. You're right back there in the solar eclipse, and she's taking facts and metric figures about Crab Nebula and whatever else it was, and distances and light years, and then she's telling you that you're dead on top of a hill looking down on the desolation of the earth. Man, huh? Good stuff. So I'm really excited to read the rest of that. I don't know if that comes across. I don't know about anybody else. I actually found the eclipse slightly disappointing. I think because I just read that, and so in my head I expected it to be this kind of like great darkening, and it wasn't, because we didn't get a total eclipse. It was a partial eclipse. And I was 10 years old when the last one took place, which is, funnily enough, probably around the time that I was writing about in this piece. So it's all very nice and comes around, which is why I think maybe it's all connected. And we weren't allowed outside to see it. So it was always a mystery to me what it actually looked like until now. And I made my little pinhole camera obscura viewer thing, which kind of worked. It had a cool projection of the sky upside down. But unfortunately, somebody had some glasses that they could lend to us and we could actually see it. It was kind of cool seeing the moon, a very physical entity, the moon, blocking, you can get your head around the fact that it's a physical thing blocking the sun, as opposed to this like thing that shines in the sky. It felt much less celestial and much more bodily, corporeal. corporeal, bodily. So that was cool. But yeah, it didn't go dark, and the birds didn't go mad, and it didn't go cold, and whatever. And our toddler was pretty unimpressed, despite the fact she kept looking at the bloody sun without glasses on, so we had to turn around. And then we drank a beer, so it was all right. Okay, so I think this is a very long episode. I'm going to trim it down, but I think this is pretty long. Yeah, I think a really good writing week. I achieved flow state, and that's such a cool thing that whether the result is good or not is kind of secondary. I had such a good time writing that, and I really hope that my instinct for what I want the piece to be comes across, and it isn't just annoying and isn't such a knee-jerk change to the rest of the pieces. I think I've decided the order in which they're going to appear in the collection. I'll talk about that probably next week, perhaps, or in later weeks when I'm about to hand in. Next week, I'm going to be working on the piece called Black Lane Ends, which is about our time living on a farm, which I think when I spoke about it originally, I'd only written maybe 600, 800 words, and it's now expanded to 2,500, something like that. And I really like where it's gone. I think this Annie Dillard stuff's going to really feed into that when I'm working on it next week. But I actually think its form is pretty much there. I probably won't add a huge amount more, not least because the word count is breathing down my neck. But I think I just want to make sure that the expansive weirdness outside of the biographical reality is present. I want to make sure that we all feel like we're embodying something that's, I keep using the word embody, I'm not going to say that, that we're all experiencing something that's slightly not real through the lens of things that actually happened. Okay, great. I hope you're all having a great week, and I wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavours, and Godspeed. Bye, 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 bye.